Welcome back to the homestead. Today we're going to make sourdough bread. Sourdough originated thousands of years ago, and it's made from the natural yeast that floats around in the environment. Basically, to get your sourdough starter, you put flour and water together, and then you allow the natural yeasts to begin to ferment the batter. In this case, we've already got our sourdough starter, and there's lots of articles online that do tell you how to do this. If you want us to do a video on how to make the sourdough starter, we can do that as well, but for now we're going to skip to making the bread. So the first process in making the bread is to expand your starter. So we have our jar here, and what we're going to do is mix equal parts flour and water into our starter. So I've got 8 ounces of starter here, a cup of flour and a cup of water. And we're going to be putting this back into the same jar in a few minutes. And so we're not going to worry about getting it all out of there. It'll just continue to be a part of the living starter for future batches of bread to come. Your measurements don't need to be completely exact on this. Just an approximation of a cup of flour and a cup of water, 1-to-1 ratio. That's what we call feeding the starter. So we're going to mix this all in until there's no more dry lumps. We're going to take a clean paper towel and wipe around the lip of our jar. You could also wash this out, but there's a bit of starter left in there that we'd like to keep. And we're just going to pour 8 ounces back into the jar. And we'll put that back in the refrigerator and save it for the next loaf of bread. Now, this is what we're going to use for the base of our bread. It's going to sit here on the counter for somewhere between 2 and 4 hours until it looks vigorously bubbly, and then I'll bring you back and we'll get on to the next step of making our bread. Alright, so yesterday we started our sourdough bread, and I said we'd be back in a couple hours, but we got busy. One of the beauties of sourdough, though, is it really can sit for quite some time, and then you can come back to it and it'll still work just fine. So we have what we started yesterday that's going to be the base of our sourdough. You can see that it has gotten nice and bubbly. It's very active. That's excellent. So we're going to put that into our bowl. The other things that we're going to use for this bread are salt, some yeast, flour, water, and a little bit of olive oil. So most of the time when you're making a sourdough bread, you don't add any additional yeast. But it's fairly cool in our house. It's about 63 degrees in here right now. And if I don't add a little bit of extra yeast, it tends to be difficult to get it to rise. So by adding the actual yeast from the store, I can get a very reliable sourdough bread, and you get all of the flavor, but a much more consistent product. So this is kind of a cheater loaf, but it's worked great for me, and really the results are more important to me than having a true pure sourdough. In the summer, I can do sourdough without it, and it works very well, but if you want to cheat a little bit and make your sourdough come out well, this is how I do it. So that's all going to go into the bowl. And then I've got a cup of hot water, and you want this water to be between about 105 and 115 degrees. That's going to activate your yeast. So I'm adding a teaspoon, which The little packets you can buy in the store are 2 1/4 teaspoons. So it's not even a full packet of yeast. So it's not very much. It's just enough to help out the bread a little bit. So we'll mix that in and we'll let that sit for just a minute while we add some of our other ingredients to the bowl, and that'll allow it to activate. So what I have here is about 6.5 cups of flour. It's tough for me to give you guys a recipe because I actually just eyeball all of this. I don't generally measure any of it, just a rough estimate. So that does make it a little bit harder. This is just sea salt, and we'll put a heavy teaspoon of that in there. And approximately a tablespoon of olive oil. And then we'll go ahead and dump in our yeast water. And for a minute here, it's going to get a bit noisy. What we're going to do is mix this in the stand mixer until it starts to kind of come together as a dough. And you could go ahead and just do this by hand, but because I have the stand mixer, this saves me a lot of kneading. And we will finish kneading it by hand just because I like the results a little bit better. You can really feel what the dough is doing, and you can decide when the right time to stop kneading is a little bit easier. So we're going to use the number 2 setting on our mixer, which is a fairly slow speed. You want to use generally 1 or 2 on your stand mixer when you're doing bread dough, so that it's not just going around really fast. You want to roll it and knead it rather than beat it up too much. So we're going to put it there and add our first cup of flour. See here is it's starting to pull away from the sides of the bowl and not be too sticky. So that means we can work it by hand. So at this point we're going to shut off the mixer and we're going to move you guys back to where you can see, and we'll do a little hand kneading on this bread. So it's very soft and quite sticky at this point, so we're just going to roll it in the flour and gently knead it until it gets to the point where it's not too sticky to handle. And then the dough will really start to come together quickly after that. And what you're looking for is for it to have a nice spring back when you push it. When you knead dough, what it does is it stretches out the gluten strands in it. And that's what allows it to rise properly and gives bread the texture that it has with the nice little air bubbles and the softness. So we're not looking to dry out our dough too much with this. We want just enough flour on it to keep it nice and workable so that it's not sticking to the counter, not sticking to our hands. And this part takes somewhere in the 3 to 5 minute range if you've done it in a stand mixer for the initial part, and the 5 to 8 minute range generally if you're kneading it purely by hand. If you're kneading in a stand mixer, you do want to be cautious not to over knead the bread because that can cause it to toughen. If you're kneading by hand, you should have a good feel for when it's done. It'll feel elasticy and stretchy, and that means that it's getting towards ready to be finished being kneaded, but it is pretty difficult to over knead bread by hand. Your arms will be tired before you get to that point generally. So this is starting to feel pretty good. If you look at it, it's got a nice smooth texture and it kind of sets up nicely. So it's a little sticky on the underside. We'll go ahead and tap just a little bit of flour on that. Now what we're going to do is to put it into an oiled bowl and let it rise for about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on your room temperature. Again, as I said, it will rise much quicker if it's in a warm room than if it's in a cold room, which is one of the reasons that we are using the actual yeast, because our room is a bit cold to do sourdough. So we're going to let you guys take a break, and we'll bring you back when this has had time to rise. All right, so our bread's had time to rise. You can see that it has gained quite a bit of volume. What we're going to do is go ahead and preheat our oven to 435 and put the cast iron pan in to heat while the oven is preheating. So we're going to then put our bread onto the parchment paper. We're going to just roll it a little bit to get the excess air bubbles out of it, and then set it on the parchment paper and put our pan in the oven to heat, and we'll bring you back once the oven's preheated.
Okay, so we're going to remove our preheated pan from our preheated oven. And before we put the bread into it, we're going to make a couple snips in the top of the loaf. This will allow it to expand evenly as it grows in the oven and keep it from bulging out the side of the loaf of bread. We'll put it into the oven for 20 minutes. After that time, we're going to spray it with water. This will help the loaf to develop a nice crunchy crust. It's not a step that you have to do, but it does lead to a better quality bread, and it'll give it that more artisan appearance and texture.
Okay, so 20 minutes has passed. Our timer has gone off, and we're going to go ahead and give the bread a quick spray. This is just plain tap water. And that will help the bread develop a beautiful crust. Now 20 minutes more in the oven, and we'll bring you back to see the finished product. Our bread is done. It's time to take it out of the oven and see how it looks. As you can see, we got a beautiful loaf, and this will be wonderful to have with dinner tonight. It's important not to cut into your bread for at least 10 to 15 minutes after you get it out of the oven. There'll still be a lot of steam inside, and if you cut it too early, it will leave the rest of the loaf a little doughy and weird. So let it have a little chance to rest, and then go ahead and enjoy a nice hot slice with some butter. We hope that you'll give sourdough bread making a try. I'll leave the recipe down in the description. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and leave them in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We hope that you'll give making sourdough. Why would you even do that? Oh, I'm dying. Now my eyes are gonna be all watery. We hope that you'll give making sourdough bread a try. I'll leave the recipe down in the description. I don't know what I'm supposed to say after that.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay.